The first sign wasn't a weapon. It was a silence. On the morning of March 14, 2187, every deep space relay station in the outer belt went dark within a span of 11 minutes. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Simply, offline. As if someone had reached across 400 million kilometers of vacuum and pressed a button labeled quiet. Commander Yara Osei was on her third cup of coffee when the alert came through. She was stationed at Lunar Monitoring Facility 7, a squat, unglamorous complex of reinforced concrete and sensor arrays buried just beneath the regolith of the moon's far side. The facility had been built to watch. That was its entire purpose. Watch, record, transmit. It had never, in 31 years of operation, seen anything like this. All outer belt relays? She asked the analyst without looking up from the data scroll. Yes, ma'am. Stations Delta 9 through Delta 20. All 11. Simultaneous signal loss. Yara set down her coffee. She crossed the room to the central display, where a real-time map of the solar system glowed in cool blue tones. 11 blinking amber lights marked the dead stations. They formed a rough crescent, not random, not coincidental. A crescent that faced outward, toward deep space, toward the direction of the Taurus molecular cloud. Pull the last telemetry from Delta 14, she said. The analyst hesitated. That's the one that went dark last. I know. The final 17 seconds of Delta 14's transmission played across the main screen. Standard sensor data. Particle density readings. Background radiation. The ordinary background noise of deep space that scientists had cataloged for 2 centuries. Then, at the end, something that wasn't ordinary. A mass reading. A gravitational mass reading. Not a comet. Not an asteroid. Not a natural formation of any kind the station's AI could classify. The system had flagged it with a single designation before going silent. Unclassified structured object. Mass, approx. 4.7 billion metric tons. Bearing. 031 BY270. Velocity. 0.008 c. Yara read the number twice. Then she read the velocity. 0.008 c. Nearly 2,500 kilometers per second. No natural object in this system moved like that on a straight line bearing. No natural object in this system had ever approached this system on a straight line bearing. Get me Admiral Chen, she said quietly. And get me the Galactic Council liaison. All of them? Every single one. What followed in the next 6 hours would later be described by historians as the most consequential window of decision-making in human history. Not because of what humanity did during those hours, but because of what humanity chose not to do. The Galactic Council, a multi-species governing body humanity had joined tentatively and conditionally just 14 years prior, had protocols for first contact scenarios. Humanity had read them, signed them, and largely agreed with their spirit. The protocols were cautious, diplomatic, built around the assumption that new civilizations should be observed before being approached, and approached before being confronted. Humanity's representative on the council, Ambassador Deo Marchetti, was woken at 0340 hours Geneva time and briefed in under 12 minutes. Her first question was the right one. Do we know who they are? The answer was no. The Council's vast archive of spacefaring civilizations, some 700 cataloged species across 40 light-years, contained no record of any known civilization in the direction of the incoming objects. The bearing suggested deep space. Unknown territory. Terra incognita in the most literal and frightening sense of the phrase. Her second question was equally important. Do they know we know? That answer was also no. Probably. The relay stations had been disabled, which suggested the incoming fleet, and by that point the word fleet was already being used, because the mass reading had been refined to suggest not one object but many, did not want to be tracked, did not want to announce itself. But they hadn't jammed Lunar Facility 7. Either because they didn't know it was there, or because they didn't consider it a threat. That was, as Admiral Chen would later note in his formal report, their first mistake. By hour 4 the picture had sharpened considerably. Earth's network of remaining long-range sensors, the ones that hadn't been disabled, the ones buried in asteroid rock and camouflaged as debris, had been quietly repositioned to track the bearing. The data was preliminary. It was incomplete. But it was enough. The fleet numbered somewhere between 60 and 90 vessels. The size estimates varied, but the smallest appeared to be roughly 3 kilometers in length. The largest, a central mass that moved at the fleet's core like the eye of a slow hurricane, was estimated at nearly 40 kilometers bow to stern. For context, humanity's largest warship, the UEN Carthage, was 1.2 kilometers long and had taken 11 years to build. There was a meeting, quickly convened, among the senior leadership of the United Earth Navy and the Galactic Council's Joint Defense Committee. Humanity's military commanders attended in person where possible, by secure quantum encrypted link where not. The Council's representatives, species from 7 different star systems, each with their own history of conflict and diplomacy, attended with visible unease. Admiral Tomasz Chin opened the meeting with the directness that had made him one of the most respected officers in human history. They disabled our relay stations without warning, without communication, and without identification. They are approaching our home system on a trajectory that does not suggest scientific exploration. I want every council member to understand what I'm telling you before we discuss options. He let the silence hold for a moment. These are not explorers. The council's senior representative, a being humanity had learned to call Ambassador Vel, a 3-limbed, slow-spoken creature from a civilization 500 years older than Earth's spacefaring era, responded with characteristic deliberation. Commander Chin, your species joined this council under the Treaty of Cooperative Security. That treaty requires consultation before any unilateral defensive action that could be interpreted as. I'm not asking for permission to fire, Chin said. I'm asking for intelligence. I'm asking whether anyone in this room knows who these people are and what they want. Because if the answer is no, then we are all in the same position, and we should be treating this as a council-level threat, not a human problem. Another silence. Longer this time. It was broken by the council's archivist, a species that communicated primarily in structured data bursts translated in real time. The translation read. Query matched. Partial record. Designation, the Veth Dominion. Status, uncontacted. Last observed, 340 years ago. Threat assessment at time of last observation, extreme. The room absorbed that. Vel spoke again, and this time the deliberate calm of his voice had something new in it. Something that Ambassador Marchetti, watching from her secure feed in Geneva, recognized immediately. Fear. Commander Chin, Vel said. The Veth Dominion does not make first contact. They make last contact. Every civilization they have encountered in our records either submitted or ceased to exist. Chin looked at the data on the screen. The 87 vessels. The 40-kilometer flagship. The cold, straight-line bearing aimed with geometric precision at the 3rd planet from an unremarkable yellow star. Then they've never met us, he said. It wasn't boastful. It wasn't a war cry. It was simply a statement of fact, spoken by a man who had spent 30 years learning everything there was to know about what human beings did when someone threatened their home. Outside the window of Lunar Facility 7, the stars continued their ancient, indifferent burning. And somewhere in the dark between them, the Veth Dominion came on. The Veth Dominion sent their terms on day 3. Not a greeting. Not an inquiry. Terms. A structured data transmission, deliberately formatted in a protocol the Galactic Council had apparently standardized 3 centuries ago, because the Veth had used it before with other civilizations in other systems, and they had learned that clarity reduced resistance. The message was 9 sentences long. It identified Earth as Resource Territory KL 7714C. It informed the inhabitants of that territory that a Dominion administrative fleet was en route to begin integration proceedings. It listed, with bureaucratic precision, what integration would require: full disarmament of any orbital platforms or defensive installations, the surrender of all communication infrastructure, the cessation of any organized governmental authority within 48 planetary hours of fleet arrival, and the registration of all biological entities for what the Veth called labor categorization. The 9th sentence was not a request. Non-compliance will result in sterilization of surface infrastructure. Resistance units will not be engaged, they will be removed. Ambassador Marchetti read the message 4 times in her office in Geneva. The building was quiet. Outside, Lake Geneva was pale and still in the early morning light. The kind of morning that made the world feel like it would last forever. She read the 9th sentence one more time. Then she drafted her response. Humanity's reply was sent 18 hours later. Not immediately, and that delay was deliberate. Admiral Chin had argued for it. Don't answer fast, he said. Fast reads as fear. Measured reads as consideration. And if they've done this before, they'll be watching how long it takes us to respond. The reply was also short. It identified itself as originating from the United Earth Nation, governing body of the 3rd planet in the Sol system, signatory member of the Galactic Council of Cooperative Species. It acknowledged receipt of the Veth communication. It noted that the territory described as KL 7714C was in fact, the sovereign homeworld of a species with a documented 12,000-year recorded history and a current population of 22.4 billion individuals. It stated, clearly and without embellishment, that Earth would not be disarming. It then did something the Veth had apparently never encountered in their centuries of integration operations. It copied the message, in full including the Veth's original transmission, to every member state of the Galactic Council. Every ambassador. Every fleet command. Every archive. It made the whole thing public. The effect within the Council was immediate and, to human observers, revealing. Because the reaction was not solidarity. Not immediately. The first reaction, among several of the older Council species, was something closer to alarm, directed not at the Veth but at humanity. Ambassador Vel requested an emergency session within hours of receiving the forwarded transmission. When Marchetti attended, she found him visibly agitated, a significant thing for a species that communicated primarily through controlled limb positioning and tonal shifts. Ambassador Marchetti, he began, by making this exchange public, you have directly provoked. I have documented, she said. There is a process. There is a fleet, she said, 87 vessels strong, bearing down on my planet with stated intent to enslave or kill 22 billion people. I followed the process. I notified the Council. The Council has a mutual defense clause in its founding charter. I'm here to invoke it. The room, a circular chamber aboard the Council's permanent station Meridian in Lagrange orbit between Earth and Moon, held representatives of 11 species. Some of them had been spacefaring for centuries before humanity had discovered fire. Some of them had fought wars that reshaped star systems. All of them were now very carefully not making eye contact with Ambassador Marchetti. She understood what she was seeing. They were afraid of the Veth. They had always been afraid of the Veth. The Veth's last recorded appearance had ended with an inhabited moon rendered uninhabitable and a civilization absorbed so completely that no cultural record survived. That was 340 years ago, and it had left a scar in galactic politics that had never fully healed. Humanity had been in the Council for 14 years. Humanity had not been there for the scar. The Mutual Defense Clause, said a representative from the Surai Collective, one of the oldest species at the table, has procedural requirements. A formal threat assessment. A council vote. How long did the last civilization they targeted have before the fleet arrived? Marchetti asked. Silence. How long? The archivist answered. The translation read, 11 days from first contact to surface bombardment. We have 8, Marchetti said. So I'd like to move quickly. What the council didn't know, what Marchetti was careful not to reveal in that session, because diplomatic chambers had a way of leaking information in all directions, was that humanity had not spent the previous 3 days simply waiting. Admiral Chen had spent those 3 days deploying. The United Earth Navy's operational doctrine had been updated 14 years ago, when humanity joined the Council and gained access to 40 years of accumulated galactic intelligence about spacefaring threats. The update had been quiet, internal, classified above the clearance level of most national governments. But its core principle was simple, almost blunt. Earth cannot be defended at Earth. Earth must be defended at distance. The UEN's forward deployment posture had been built around this principle. Not to fight at the planet, fighting at the planet meant the planet could be hit. The doctrine called for engagement at the edges of the system, using mobility, information, and, where necessary, the kind of improvised operational creativity that human commanders had demonstrated, with some consistency, throughout their military history. By the time Marchetti was sitting in the council chamber invoking mutual defense clauses, 43 UN vessels had already slipped their moorings and were accelerating outward. Not at the Veth fleet. Not directly. They were moving to pre-calculated intercept geometries, positions chosen to maximize sensor coverage, communication relay capacity, and, if it came to it, engagement options. They were also, with careful and deliberate effort, moving in ways that would be difficult to detect from the Veth fleet's current bearing. Admiral Chen was not trying to hide the fact that Earth was preparing to fight. He was trying to ensure that when the Veth looked at the tactical picture, they saw something they recognized. A smaller force, clearly outgunned, making obvious defensive preparations in high orbit. He wanted them to see what they expected to see. What he was actually building was something else entirely. On day 4, the Veth fleet crossed the heliopause. They were inside the solar system now. Still 9 days from Earth at their current velocity, but inside. In the same ocean, if not yet in the same bay. Sensor data from humanity's hidden relay network, the stations the Veth hadn't found, nestled in the debris fields of the outer belt, painted a clearer picture of the fleet's composition. Analysts at 14 different facilities worked in parallel, cross-referencing against what little the Council archives held on Veth technology. The flagship was confirmed at 38 kilometers. It appeared to be a command and control vessel, not a weapons platform. Its mass signature suggested it carried administrative infrastructure, possibly habitation modules, almost certainly the integration apparatus the Veth used to process conquered populations. It was built for occupation, not assault. The assault ships were the mid-sized vessels, 22 of them, each roughly 5 to 8 kilometers long and dense with what analysts were classifying as directed energy emitters and mass driver systems. The remaining ships appeared to be troop carriers, supply vessels, and what the AI kept flagging as unclassified support craft, small, fast, and moving in tight formation around the flagship. Colonel Amara Diallo, leading the analysis team at Facility 7, sent her summary to Admiral Chen with a single personal note appended below the formal report. They packed for occupation. Not for resistance. They are not expecting a fight. Chen read it once. Forwarded it to his operational commanders. Then he looked at the trajectory data again. The cold, straight line. The precision of it. The confidence. He thought about every civilization the Veth had integrated. Everyone that had seen this same fleet approaching and done the math, 87 ships, 40-kilometer flagship, overwhelming force projection, and concluded the math didn't work in their favor. He thought about what those civilizations hadn't known. That the math was only part of it. The Council voted on day 5. The result was not what Marchetti had asked for. 7 species voted in favor of opening formal diplomatic dialogue with the Veth Dominion. 3 voted to abstain, citing insufficient intelligence on Veth intentions, which struck Marchetti as a curious position given that the Veth had transmitted their intentions in writing. 1 species, the Surai Collective, voted in favor of invoking the Mutual Defense Clause. 1. The motion failed. Marchetti sat in her seat in the council chamber for a long moment after the vote was announced. The room had the particular kind of quiet that follows a decision that everyone present knows is wrong, but that no one has the courage to reverse. She looked around at the representatives of civilizations that had been sailing the stars for centuries. Civilizations that had built wonders. That had survived their own wars and their own catastrophes and arrived here, in this chamber, as proof that intelligence could endure. And they were terrified. Not of losing. Of being noticed. Because that, Marchetti finally understood, was what galactic politics looked like at scale. You survived not by fighting the thing that could destroy you, but by making sure it didn't look your way. The Veth had chosen Earth. Earth was the problem. If Earth could become someone else's problem, or simply cease to be a problem at all, the rest of the council could go back to not being looked at. She stood up. I want to formally note, she said, addressing the chamber with the flat, precise tone of someone recording things for a historical record, that the Galactic Council of Cooperative Species, upon receiving documented evidence of a genocidal fleet approaching a member world with stated intent to enslave or destroy its population, voted to request a conversation. She paused. I also want to note that Earth is not waiting for the conversation to conclude. She left before anyone could respond. What Marchetti meant, and what Admiral Chen had already set in motion, was not a dramatic, cinematic charge into battle. It was something more human than that. More characteristically human, in the sense that historians would later argue made humanity different not in its courage but in its particular brand of practical problem-solving. Earth couldn't match the Veth in raw tonnage. The numbers were unambiguous on that point. 87 ships against a hastily deployed forward force of 43 was already a hard equation. Factor in the size differential, Veth vessels averaging 4 times the displacement of comparable UN ships, and the equation became, on paper, unreasonable. So humanity didn't fight the equation. It changed the problem. The core of Chen's operational plan, formally designated Operation Threshold and classified at a level that meant fewer than 200 people on Earth knew its full scope, rested on 3 interconnected ideas. The first was denial of information. The Veth fleet had disabled the outer belt relay stations on approach. What they didn't know was that those stations had been transmitting continuously for 3 days before they went dark. Not standard telemetry. Formatted sensor data, compressed and burst transmitted to a network of passive listening posts that the Veth couldn't find because they weren't transmitting, they were only receiving. Humanity knew almost exactly where every Veth ship was, at almost any given moment. The Veth knew only that Earth had a navy and that it appeared to be deploying in high orbit. The second idea was terrain. The solar system was not empty space. It was full of things, The asteroid belt, the Kuiper belt, Trojan clusters, shepherd moons, the complex gravitational architecture of a mature planetary system. A civilization that had never operated in Sol before would have charts. They would have long-range surveys. What they wouldn't have was the accumulated operational knowledge of a species that had been sending ships through this system for 150 years. Chen's forward units knew the terrain the way infantry knows a forest. They knew the shadows, the dead zones, the angles that sensors struggled with, that gravity wells complicated, that debris clouds obscured. The third idea was the one that Chen had kept most tightly controlled, because it was the one that had made his own senior staff look at him with a complicated mixture of concern and respect when he proposed it. Don't let them reach orbit. Every historical case in the Council archives where the Veth had successfully integrated a civilization had one thing in common: they had reached orbit. Once in orbit, the calculus of defense shifted catastrophically. Orbital bombardment was too fast, too scalable, too cheap in terms of Veth losses. The surface became a hostage. And when a planet's surface becomes a hostage, you've already lost the war. You're just deciding how much you're willing to pay. Chen's doctrine was simple. The engagement would happen in the outer system. In the dark, in the cold, in the terrain that humanity knew and the Veth didn't. Earth would not be a fortress. Earth would be a destination they would never reach. Day 6. The first contact, actual physical contact, not signal contact, happened not where the Veth expected it. The UEN frigate Persistent Question was 340 million kilometers from Earth, running dark behind a carbonaceous chondrite asteroid in the Midbelt region. Its crew of 61 had been there for 4 days, running on minimum power, breathing recycled air, watching the Veth fleets approach on passive sensors. Commander Lena Vasquez was its captain. She was 37 years old, a second-generation spacer from Callisto Station, and she had been briefed on Operation Threshold in full. She understood her role. She was not there to fight. She was there to look. At 0614 hours on day 6, one of the Veth fleet's forward scouts, a fast vessel roughly half a kilometer long, running ahead of the main body, passed within 900,000 kilometers of the Persistent Question's position. Close enough that Vasquez's sensors could resolve hull detail. Close enough to see that the ship's external configuration included multiple sensor arrays, all of them oriented forward, toward Earth, toward the inner system. None of them were looking back. She recorded everything. Then she transmitted it in a compressed burst, back to Chen's command ship. The scout passed. The Persistent Question remained invisible. Dark. Still. But what Vasquez had recorded, the sensor array configuration, the specific frequencies the scout was emitting, the blind spots in its coverage, was processed within hours into a targeting profile that would be distributed to every forward UEN vessel. The Veth scouts were deaf behind them. They were looking for an enemy in the direction they were going. They didn't understand that the enemy had already been watching them for 4 days. The Council's diplomatic message to the Veth Dominion was transmitted on day 7. It was a careful, measured document. It expressed the Council's desire for peaceful resolution. It requested the Veth fleet pause its advance pending formal diplomatic dialogue. It offered, as a gesture of good faith, a neutral meeting point in the outer system where representatives could convene. The Veth response came 6 hours later. It was 4 words. Your time has passed. The council chamber went very quiet when the translation came through. Then, slowly, the representatives began talking among themselves, not to Marchetti, not to the human liaison staff, but to each other, in the layered, frequency-rich communications of species that had been navigating political crises for centuries longer than humanity had been keeping written records. Marchetti watched them from across the chamber and recognized what was happening. They were recalibrating. They had voted for diplomacy because they believed on some level that it might work. Or more precisely, they had voted for diplomacy because they didn't believe Earth had any other options and they'd wanted to be on the correct side of history if the Veth chose to listen. Now the Veth had answered, and the answer was unambiguous, and the Council was realizing that there was going to be a fight regardless of what they'd voted for. The only question left was whether they would be in it. Ambassador Vell crossed the chamber and stood beside Marchetti. He was quiet for a moment, watching the data feeds showing the Veth fleet's position. 7 days from Earth. Advancing at steady, confident speed. Your Admiral, Vell said. He has a plan. It wasn't a question. He has a plan, Marchetti confirmed. Tell me, Vell said, and his voice had something new in it, not the fear she'd heard before but something older, something that civilizations develop when they've watched enough history to know the difference between a desperate gamble and a calculated move. Does the plan have a reasonable chance of success? Marchetti thought about Chin. About Vasquez in the dark behind her asteroid. About the 43 ships she couldn't tell Vel about. About the 3 ideas at the core of Operation Threshold. Define reasonable, she said. Vel considered this. Non-negligible, he said. Marchetti looked at the fleet data on the screen. 87 ships. 40-kilometer flagship. Coming in straight and confident and completely certain of what they were going to find at the end of that bearing. Yes, she said. It has a non-negligible chance. Vel was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said carefully, I believe the Surai Collective may have additional vessels that are currently unscheduled. Marchetti turned to look at him. How many? She asked. Enough, he said, to make a statement. If the statement turns out to be worth making. It was the most commitment she was going to get. She took it. The first shots were not fired. They were placed. On day 8 at 0300 hours fleet time, Admiral Chin gave the authorization for Phase 1 of Operation Threshold. Across a front 300 million kilometers wide, 43 UN vessels emerged from their concealed positions in the mid-belt and began moving. Not charging, moving. Repositioning with precise, coordinated purpose, like pieces on a board being settled into their final configuration before a game begins. The Veth fleet's forward sensors picked up the movement within 2 hours. What they saw, what they were meant to see, was a human defensive line forming at the edge of the asteroid belt. 43 ships, arranged in a rough crescent facing the incoming fleet. Outgunned, outmassed, but present. A civilization refusing to simply kneel. The Veth fleet's command had presumably seen versions of this before. A last-ditch defensive formation by a civilization that understood it was outclassed but couldn't bring itself to surrender. It was, in the context of Veth operational history, a minor inconvenience. The kind of thing you move through on the way to orbit, not around. That assumption was the load-bearing structure of Chen's plan. Because the 43 ships on the defensive line were not the plan. They were the display. Behind them, in the debris fields and shadow zones that 4 days of quiet reconnaissance had mapped in extraordinary detail, were another 22 vessels, smaller, faster, and carrying something humanity had been developing quietly for 11 years. The program was called Slingshot. Officially, it was a deep space mining assist technology, a series of mass driver platforms that could accelerate cargo containers along pre-calculated trajectories through the asteroid belt. Unofficially, at a classification level that had required personal sign-off from 3 consecutive Earth heads of state, the Slingshot platforms had been tested, refined, and integrated into UN operational doctrine as something else entirely. Kinetic delivery systems. Prepositioned. Gravity-assisted. Traveling at velocities that no active propulsion system needed to generate because the solar system's own orbital mechanics had been doing the work for weeks. The rocks were already moving. Had been moving for 14 days, since the relay stations went dark and Chen had authorized pre-deployment. Hundreds of them, ranging from 1-ton precision projectiles to 70-ton unguided impactors, all of them following calculated paths that converged on the Veth fleet's projected transit corridor. Not aimed at ships, aimed at space. At the specific coordinates the Veth fleet would occupy at specific times, based on their steady, confident, unchanging approach vector. They hadn't maneuvered once since entering the system. Why would they? They'd done this before. The approach vector was optimal. The defensive force ahead of them was visible and manageable. There was no reason to deviate. That was the second load-bearing assumption Chen was counting on. The engagement began at 1,147 hours on day 8 and lasted, in its first phase, approximately 90 minutes. The Veth fleet's lead vessels encountered the first kinetic objects at extreme range, far enough out that individual impacts were minor, small rocks burning against shields or hull plating, the kind of navigational debris any spacefaring vessel dealt with in asteroid belt transit. Nuisances. Nothing more. Then the density increased. Not suddenly. Gradually. Methodically. Each wave slightly heavier than the last, the trajectory distributions tightening as the Veth fleet moved further into the corridor. The Veth command's response was, initially, exactly what Chen had modeled. They adjusted formation, compressing their fleet into a tighter defensive configuration, activating point defense systems and continuing their advance. The tighter formation was what the Slingshot system had been designed to exploit. When ships moved closer together to protect each other from inbound debris, the coverage zones of their point defense systems overlapped, which was the intended effect, the logical response. But overlapping coverage created interference patterns. Dead zones where 2 point defense systems targeting solutions conflicted with each other. The slingshot platforms targeting AI had been calculating those interference patterns in real time, updating trajectory solutions every 8 seconds. The larger impactors weren't aimed at ships. They were aimed at the dead zones between ships. The physics of the detonations, the kinetic energy release of 70-ton objects moving at 0.006 c, detonating in the gaps between Veth hulls, wasn't designed to destroy. It was designed to disorder. The expanding debris clouds, the electromagnetic pulse signatures, the secondary fragment patterns generated when impactors struck the surfaces of nearby asteroids, all of it fed into the chaotic environment that the Veth sensors were now trying to interpret. Chaos is not the friend of a fleet that has never operated in a specific star system before. At 1,203 hours, the first confirmed Veth vessel broke formation. It was a mid-sized assault ship, 5 kilometers long, that had taken a direct impact on its port lateral section from a 40-ton impactor that its point defense system had failed to neutralize. The impact hadn't destroyed it, but it had disabled 2 of its drive nodes and sent it into a slow rotation that removed it from the fleet's coordinated formation. The UEN destroyer Ambedkar had been waiting in a sensor shadow behind a Trojan asteroid for this exact scenario. It emerged, fired a 7-second burst from its directed energy batteries at the rotating Veth ship's exposed drive section, and was back behind the asteroid before the Veth fleet's fire control systems had finished calculating a targeting solution. The Veth ship lost propulsion entirely. It was still intact, still manned, but it was no longer part of the fleet. It was debris. Ambedkar's captain logged the action in 6 words: target disabled. No UEN casualties. Withdrawing. That was how Phase 1 of Operation Threshold worked. Not pitched battles. Not heroic charges. Methodical, calculated, operationally specific interventions, executed at times and places of UEN choosing, against a fleet that was increasingly discovering that the environment it was moving through was not the benign transit corridor it had appeared to be. Over the next 90 minutes, 4 more Veth vessels were separated from the main body. 3 by kinetic impacts. 1 by a coordinated attack from 2 UEN ships that had flanked it while its sensors were saturated by a debris cloud. None of the 5 were destroyed. All of them were disabled or damaged severely enough to require withdrawal from the advance. The Veth fleet still had 82 functional vessels. They still vastly outnumbered and outmassed the UEN forces. But they had stopped moving. The Veth fleet's halt was logged by every passive sensor station in the mid-belt at 1,319 hours. Chen received the notification on his command ship, the UEN Johannesburg, a heavy cruiser running dark 80 million kilometers from the engagement zone, and allowed himself, very briefly, to close his eyes. They'd stopped. That was the first threshold. A fleet that had never stopped for anything had stopped. It didn't mean they were beaten. It meant they were thinking. What they were thinking about, Chen knew, was the question that no Veth integration operation had apparently ever had to seriously consider: what do we do when the terrain fights back? The answer they were developing, based on the fleet's observed behavior over the next 4 hours, the repositioning of their assault ships, the activation of additional sensor platforms, the communications traffic that UEN signals intelligence was intercepting in encrypted bursts it couldn't fully decode but could analyze for volume and pattern, was the answer that Chen had been preparing for. They were going to maneuver. They were going to clear the corridor by force before resuming the advance. They were going to sweep the asteroid belt zone with overwhelming firepower and create a safe passage to the inner system. Would work. Probably. They had the firepower for it. The question was how long it would take and what it would cost them. All right, Chen said to his tactical staff. They're adjusting. Phase 2 on my mark. He looked at the fleet display. 82 ships. Still a significant force. Still capable of reaching orbit if they cleared the belt. But they were no longer moving in a straight line. They were no longer certain. They were no longer operating inside their own operational model. And somewhere in the outer system, the Surai Collective's unscheduled vessels were dropping their stealth profiles for the first time. The Council was watching. More importantly, the Council was deciding. The Veth Dominion had a word, untranslatable in any direct sense, but approximated in Council records as unscheduled friction, for the kind of resistance that fell outside their operational models. It wasn't a military term. It was an administrative one. Friction in the Veth system of expansion was expected, categorized, and managed. There were protocols for orbital defense platforms, for organized fleet resistance, for guerrilla operations on planetary surfaces. There was no protocol for what was happening in the Sol asteroid belt. Because what was happening didn't match any category of resistance the Veth had encountered before. It wasn't a fixed defense, There was no line of ships to break through. It wasn't fleet action. The human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts, never committing to engagement, never allowing the Veth's superior firepower to be brought to bear in a decisive exchange. It was something the Veth's operational history had no reference point for, and their command structure, which relied apparently on hierarchical authorization for any significant deviation from integration protocol, was not designed to respond to it quickly. This was something Colonel Diallo's intelligence analysis had flagged 3 days before the engagement began. The Veth are good at what they've always done, she had written in her assessment. They are not adaptable in the way that comes from having fought wars where the enemy changed on you. Their expansion history has been consistent. They arrive, the target civilization either submits or makes a conventional resistance that the Veth's firepower overwhelms, and the operation concludes. They have never had to revise doctrine mid-operation. Diallo's assessment had a note at the bottom, underlined, "This advantage has a time limit. Once they establish a new operational baseline, the friction advantage diminishes. Phase 2 must begin before that baseline is set." Chin had agreed. He'd set the Phase 2 trigger at 72 hours after the fleet halt. He pulled it at 60. Phase 2 was not a second wave of kinetic attacks. Phase 2 was a conversation. At 1,600 hours on day 8, a tight beam transmission was sent from the UN Johannesburg directly to the Veth fleet's flagship. It was sent in the Veth's own communication protocol, the same protocol they'd used for their 9-sentence demand. It was brief and factual, and it was accompanied by a data package. The data package contained the tactical log from Phase 1. Every Veth ship disabled. Every kinetic impact calculated to within tolerances that made it clear this had not been improvised. The trajectories of the slingshot impactors, retroactively plotted to show their point of origin and the timing of their pre-deployment, showing the Veth that these hadn't been launched when the fleet entered the system. They'd been launched before the relay stations went dark. Humanity had anticipated the approach and begun deploying before the Veth had announced themselves. The transmission itself was short. It read, "You disabled 11 of our monitoring stations. You had not yet identified yourself. We responded to your approach as a potential threat and prepared accordingly. This was rational behavior on our part. The ongoing engagement in the outer belt is the consequence of your decision to continue after our defensive preparations were in place. You have lost 5 vessels. We have lost none. We are prepared to continue on these terms for as long as you wish. We are also prepared to stop if you are." It was signed by Admiral Chin with his rank and full name. And then, most unusually and after considerable debate within the UN command staff, it included a postscript. "Your designation of our world as KL 7714C is noted. We call it Earth. It is not a resource territory. It is a home. The people defending it understand the difference and they will continue to do so." The Surai Collective's unscheduled vessels arrived at the outer system perimeter on day 9. There were 14 of them. Not a massive force by any galactic standard. The Surai were a civilization that had not fought a major war in over 2 centuries and whose military capacity had atrophied accordingly. But 14 Surai vessels were 14 more ships than the Veth had planned on encountering, and they arrived not in the asteroid belt engagement zone but in a position that the Veth fleet's revised tactical picture could not ignore, directly astern. Between the Veth fleet and the outer system. Between the Veth fleet and the exit they would need if they chose to withdraw. They weren't blocking it. The Surai formation was not a blockade. It was, in the careful language of Surai military doctrine, a position of observation. But it was a message. The Veth fleet was no longer operating in a star system where one isolated species was making an inconvenient amount of noise. They were now in a star system where a second spacefaring civilization had chosen to physically manifest its interest in the outcome. Other council members were watching the situation develop with the particular intensity of species trying to calculate which side of history they wanted to be on. Ambassador Vell had spent 36 hours in continuous communication with 6 different council delegations. He had not slept. He had, by his own cultural standards, been performing the most vigorous diplomatic activity of his career. What he was doing, in essence, was helping the council species remember what they already knew but had been too afraid to act on, that the Veth integration model only worked when no one resisted it. The moment credible resistance appeared, the model's economics changed. The Veth's entire history of expansion was built on the assumption that the cost of acquisition would remain low. A target that turned the cost high broke the model. Earth was making the cost high. And if Earth could survive long enough, if Operation Threshold could hold the Veth at distance for long enough, the political calculations of every council species would shift. Because none of them wanted the Veth in the inner galaxy. They just concluded that wanting something and being willing to fight for it were different calculations, and the fight calculation had never added up in their favor. Until now, perhaps, it was adding up differently. The Veth fleet's response to Chen's message came 27 hours after transmission. It was a single line. Define your terms for cessation. Chen read it 3 times. He showed it to no one for 2 full minutes. Then he walked to the Johannesburg's observation deck, a small, dark room with a viewport that looked out at the stars, and stood there for a long moment. They were asking for terms. Not conceding. Not apologizing. Not withdrawing. But asking what it would take to stop the fighting. That was not victory. It was not even close to victory. But it was a conversation, and conversations, unlike battles, had possibilities that couldn't be calculated in advance. He thought about the Veth fleet commanders on the other side of that exchange, beings he'd never seen, whose biology he didn't know, whose decision-making culture he understood only through second-hand intelligence. He thought about what it must be like to be in their position. An integration operation that had, for the first time in anyone's recorded memory, stopped and asked a question. That had met friction and, instead of powering through it the way they always had paused. That pause mattered. More than the military outcome of Phase 1. More than the Surai ships astern. The pause mattered because it meant that somewhere in the Veth command structure, a calculation had changed. He drafted his response carefully. We do not seek the destruction of your fleet. We seek the recognition of Earth's sovereignty and the permanent removal of Earth from Veth integration targeting. In return, we are prepared to cease all active kinetic operations and hold current positions. We propose a formal diplomatic framework under Galactic Council oversight. What we are not prepared to do is surrender. We will defend this system at whatever cost is required. That statement should be treated as a factual assessment, not a posture. He read it once more. Added 1 line. We have prepared for this conversation and for the alternative. We would prefer the conversation. Send it. On Earth it was a Tuesday morning. Somewhere over the Pacific, the sun was rising in the particular way it did when the atmosphere scattered the light into long horizontal bands of orange and deep blue. People were waking up, making coffee, taking their children to school, living the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of human life on a world they had never seriously imagined might stop existing. Most of them didn't know the details. The broad outlines had been announced: an unknown fleet, a defensive response, ongoing negotiations, but the operational details of Threshold were still classified, and the full diplomatic picture was still being assembled. But in cities across 6 continents, people had stepped outside or looked up from screens to watch the night sky in the days since the announcement. Not panicked, not paralyzed, watching, with the particular quiet attention of a species that had learned, over millennia of hard experience, that the sky sometimes mattered in ways you hadn't expected. There was something in that, Chen thought. Something that was difficult to articulate in a military report, but that felt relevant. They weren't afraid of what was up there. They were paying attention to it. That was different. Negotiations, when they began in earnest, took place in the most unlikely venue in recorded galactic history. Not on Meridian Station. Not in the council chamber. Not in neutral deep space. Aboard the UN Johannesburg, 300 million kilometers from Earth, in a converted crew briefing room that smelled faintly of recycled air and instant coffee and had motivational posters on the wall that no one had gotten around to removing. The Veth delegation consisted of 3 individuals. Their physical form was something humanity had not yet encountered directly: bilateral, approximately 2 meters tall, covered in a fine-scaled integument of dark gray, with paired optical structures that sat high on a narrow, elongated skull. They moved with a deliberate economy of motion that Ambassador Marchetti, watching through the video feed from Meridian, found herself filing away as they have very good proprioceptive control, the thought of an anthropologist surfacing at an inopportune moment. The Veth lead negotiator was designated, in council translation, as Integration Coordinator Harvan. A bureaucratic title. An administrative title. Which told Chin something important. The Veth had sent an administrator to discuss the terms of a military situation. That was either a sign of flexibility, of genuine willingness to recategorize the situation from military to diplomatic, or it was a tactic, a way of reducing the apparent status of the negotiation by populating it with officials rather than commanders. Chen had brought Colonel Diallo and Ambassador Marchetti's deputy, a young man named Pablo Ruiz who had a background in conflict resolution and spoke 6 languages, none of which were Veth. He had also brought himself. He was not a diplomat. He had made this clear to Marchetti, who had made it clear to the council, who had made clear their reservations. He had listened to those reservations and attended anyway because this was not, in his assessment, primarily a diplomatic situation. It was a military situation that had reached a decision point, and the presence of someone who understood the military situation from the inside was, in his professional judgment, more valuable than procedural correctness. Harvan opened the session with a statement that was, Ruiz noted afterward, exactly what you'd expect from a civilization that had never previously sat across a table from a species that had made them stop. The Dominion recognizes that the integration of Sol System resource territory has encountered unexpected complications, Harvan said. We are prepared to discuss revised timelines. Silence. Chin looked at Ruiz. Ruiz looked at Diallo. Diallo looked at the table. Chin said, we're not discussing timelines. Harvan's optical structures shifted in a way the council translators had flagged as reassessment expression. The Dominion's territorial classification of this system is established under Dominion Administrative. Is not recognized by us, the Galactic Council or any other party at this table, Chin said. The classification is rescinded. That's the starting point of this conversation, not the ending point. Another silence. Longer. The Dominion does not rescind territorial classifications, Harvan said. But the statement was delivered, Diallo noted, without the categorical firmness it would have had 48 hours ago. There was something in the phrasing, does not, rather than cannot or will not, that left grammatical space. You've never been in a situation where it was the rational choice, Chin said. Let's discuss whether this is that situation. What followed was 11 hours of negotiation, interrupted 3 times by meal breaks that were logistically awkward given the dietary incompatibilities involved, and once by an incident where a junior UN crew member had accidentally wandered into the corridor where the VETH delegation was waiting and had, apparently, just nodded and continued to the bathroom without breaking stride. An anecdote that would later circulate widely and be cited by several council sociologists as the most efficient first contact interaction in recorded history. The substantive content of the negotiation was complex and contentious and involved numerous points of genuine difficulty. But 3 things became clear during those 11 hours. The first was that the VETH had not expected to still be here. Their integration timeline, based on Harvan's inadvertent references, had called for orbital insertion within 3 days of entering the system. They were now on day 10, still in the outer system, with 5 ships disabled and a debris corridor between them and the inner planets that would require significant effort to clear. The economic calculus of the operation, and the VETH, it turned out, thought about expansion in very specifically economic terms, had shifted substantially. The second was that the VETH were aware of the Surai ships astern and were aware of what they represented. Not a military threat, necessarily, but a signal. A signal that Earth had allies. That the Council, or at least a portion of it, had decided that the political cost of inaction was higher than the political cost of positioning. That this was not, as Harvan had apparently told the VETH Fleet Command before entering negotiations, a contained bilateral situation. The third, and this was the one that took hours to surface and when it did, it changed the texture of the room, was that the VETH had a protocol for this. Not for defeat. Not for withdrawal. But for reclassification. In the VETH administrative system, a territory could be reclassified from integration target to registered sovereign space under specific conditions. The conditions were narrow and had apparently never been met in the modern era of VETH expansion. But they existed. The protocol existed. Which meant that at some point in their history, the VETH had encountered a situation where it was rational to stop, to recognize, to step back. Diallo passed Chin a note under the table. They have a face-saving mechanism. They built it in. Someone designed a way out. Chin had read the same thing and arrived at the same conclusion. He adjusted his approach. The Council's role in the final framework was significant, and for several Council species uncomfortable, because it required them to formally acknowledge that the Mutual Defense Clause had been applicable from the beginning and that their initial vote had been, to use the diplomatic term, procedurally unfortunate. Vel's quiet work over the preceding days had shifted 4 species to an actively supportive position. 2 others moved to supportive abstention, which in Council politics was meaningfully different from their previous strategic abstention. The framework that emerged, the Sol Sovereignty Accord, a name chosen by Ruiz that Chin thought was slightly overblown but that Marchetti approved, established Earth's recognized sovereign status, removed the Dominion's territorial designation, and created a formal Council-mediated framework for any future contact between humanity and the VETH Dominion. It also, in a clause that Chin had insisted on and that the VETH had resisted longest, included a formal acknowledgement that the Veth's approach to the Sol system had constituted an unauthorized act of aggression against a Council member state, and that the Council had a responsibility to monitor and respond to similar situations involving any member state in the future. The Veth had agreed to this clause last, and only after 11 hours. Harvan's final acceptance of it was delivered in a tone that Ruiz, reviewing the translation afterward, described as someone who is conceding a point they plan to revisit. Chen noted this. Noted it, filed it, and made sure it was in the formal record. Because this was not the end of anything. It was an armistice, not a peace. The Veth Dominion was a civilization of genuine scale and genuine capability, and the Sol Sovereignty Accord represented a tactical recalibration on their part, not a philosophical conversion. The situation had been operationally inconvenient. It had not been existentially threatening to them. The difference between inconvenient and existential was something humanity would need to continue addressing. But the fleet turned around. That was real. That was documented. That was precedent. Ambassador Vel watched the Veth fleet's departure on the sensor display in the council chamber. He watched the 82 functional vessels, and the 5 disabled ones that their companions had attached towing cables to, which Vel found interesting in a way he couldn't quite articulate, reverse their bearing and begin the long acceleration back toward the heliopause. He stood there for a long time after they were gone from visual range. Marchetti stood beside him. 400 years, Vel said. 400 years since anyone made the Veth stop. I know, Marchetti said. Your species has been in space for less than 2 centuries. I know. Vel turned to look at her. His optical structures, which Marchetti had learned to read in a limited way over 14 years of working with him, held something she recognized as the Surai equivalent of a complicated, unresolved emotion. We should have voted differently, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. We were afraid. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. The Veth will come back. Perhaps not in my lifetime. Perhaps not in yours. But they will reconsider. I expect so, Marchetti said. Your people should prepare for that. She looked at the now empty bearing on the sensor display. The cold, dark corridor of space where 87 ships had been moving with absolute confidence a week ago. Admiral Chen, she said, is already writing the after-action report. The after-action report filed by Admiral Tomasz Chen was 847 pages long. It covered operational planning, tactical execution, intelligence failures, intelligence successes, logistical assessments, crew performance evaluations, and a detailed technical analysis of Veth fleet capabilities as observed during the engagement. It was precise and thorough and written in the flat, exhausted prose of someone who had not slept properly in 12 days. The final section was 3 pages long. It was titled, Observations for Future Doctrine Development. It did not celebrate. It did not declare victory. It began with a sentence that the UEN would later use in its officer training curriculum, and that Galactic Council archivists would catalog as one of the most widely circulated human documents in the first 2 centuries of Earth's spacefaring history. What occurred in the Sol system between March and March of 2187 should not be understood as a demonstration of human military superiority. We are not superior. We are different, in specific ways, from the adversary we faced, and those differences were operationally relevant. Understanding which differences mattered and why, is the purpose of this section. Chin identified 4 differences. The first was terrain familiarity. We fought in our own system. The Veth did not. This advantage was decisive in Phase 1 and would have remained significant through Phase 2 had that phase been necessary. Any future adversary that has operated in Sol space longer than we have negates this advantage. We should plan accordingly. The second was information asymmetry. Our passive sensor network provided near real-time fleet tracking of the Veth advance while the Veth operated on significantly degraded intelligence about our force disposition. This asymmetry was deliberately engineered and was the product of investments made before this specific threat was identified. General investment in passive sensor infrastructure pays specific dividends. The third was doctrinal flexibility. The Veth's operational doctrine had not been revised under genuine adversarial pressure in several centuries. Ours had been revised 11 days before the engagement. This difference in doctrinal currency is not a permanent advantage. It is a product of continuous investment in scenario analysis, wargaming, and honest assessment of potential adversaries. It must be maintained. The fourth was the one that occupied the longest portion of the 3 pages, and the one that Chin returned to, revised, and rewrote 4 times before submitting. He called it cost tolerance. The Veth's expansion model is built around a specific cost-benefit calculation, The cost of integration should be low, the benefit should be high, and the two figures should never be allowed to approach each other. When the cost of integration rises, through resistance, through delay, through the involvement of additional parties, the calculation changes. Our objective in Operation Threshold was never to destroy the Veth fleet. We could not have done so. Our objective was to raise the cost of continuing until it exceeded the cost of stopping. We achieved this objective. Future operations against adversaries with similar expansion models should use this framework as their starting point. Then, below the analysis, a single paragraph that was not doctrine. It was observation. I want to note for the record that the crews of every vessel involved in Operation Threshold performed beyond any reasonable expectation. They operated for extended periods in extreme isolation, under significant psychological pressure, with incomplete information and genuine uncertainty about the outcome. They did not panic. They did not freeze. They did what they had been trained to do and, in several cases, more than what training could have prepared them for. Commander Vasquez of the Persistent Question spent 4 days in near total silence behind an asteroid while an alien fleet passed within 900,000 kilometers of her ship. Her crew did the same. When I asked her afterward whether they had been afraid, she said, "Of course we were. We were afraid the whole time. But we had a job to do, so we did it." I don't have a better description of what made this operation possible. The Galactic Council's formal response to the Sole Sovereignty Accord took 11 months to fully ratify. The procedural requirements were extensive, and several species required considerable internal debate before committing to the precedent that the Accord established, because it was, as several Council legal scholars noted, the first time in 300 years that the Council had formally documented a successful armed resistance to Veth integration, and the precedent had implications that extended well beyond the Sol system. 3 civilizations and systems adjacent to known Veth operational corridors, species that had quietly been paying tribute to Veth administrative vessels in exchange for being passed over, privately contacted the Council in the months following the Accord. 2 of them requested information about humanity's operational doctrine. 1 requested a meeting. The Council's archivists noted all of this and filed it. Ambassador Vell noted it too, and he began quietly restructuring the Surai Collective's dormant military protocols for the first time in 60 years. On Earth, the aftermath was quieter than the event. There were ceremonies. Memorial services for the 18 crew members who had been injured in various engagements during Phase 1. None killed, a fact that Chin had noted with relief and professional satisfaction in equal measure. A public acknowledgement from every major government on Earth. A document signed by the heads of state of the United Earth Nation that was short and plain in language. To the crew of every vessel that held the line in the outer system, you were asked to do something no human being had been asked to do before, and you did it. The world you defended is grateful. In the cities, in the towns, in the unremarkable morning routines that had continued largely uninterrupted throughout the crisis, people absorbed the news with the particular mixture of relief and sober appreciation that comes from a danger narrowly passed. Not triumphalism. Not the chest-beating certainty that they were the greatest civilization in the galaxy. Something quieter than that. Something more enduring. The understanding that they had been tested and had not failed the test, and that the test was not over. Commander Lena Vasquez returned to Callisto Station 8 weeks after the Accord was signed. She had been promoted twice in the interim. She declined multiple interview requests from media outlets. She accepted one, a long-form piece for a scientific journal that wanted to document the operational experience of the Persistent Questions crew. The interview lasted 4 hours. Most of it was technical. Sensor logs. Decision protocols. Power management during the extended dark running period. At the end, the journalist, a woman who had been covering space operations for 30 years, asked her one last question. When the Veth Scout passed 900,000 kilometers from your position, and you were running on minimum power with 61 crew members in complete silence, what were you thinking? Vasquez thought about it for a moment. I was thinking about the data, she said. About whether our sensor suite was getting clean reads on the Scout's array configuration. About whether the burst transmission we were preparing would compress cleanly enough to avoid detection. About whether Ensign Park in the sensor bay had remembered to recalibrate the passive array after the power cycle. She paused. Technical things. I was thinking about the job. Were you thinking about Earth? The journalist asked. About what would happen if you failed? No, Vasquez said. If you think about consequences, you make mistakes. You think about the job in front of you. The consequences take care of themselves if you do the job right. The journalist wrote that down. Then she asked, and did you think at any point that you wouldn't make it? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, genuinely considering the question. I thought about it, she said. But thinking about it and believing it are different things. I never believed we weren't going to make it. Not because I was certain we would, I wasn't. But because giving up on the possibility of making it doesn't help you make it. Another pause. Does that make sense? I think so, the journalist said. We're stubborn, Vasquez said, with the small, tired smile of someone who has been through something real and come out the other side with no particular interest in dramatizing it. Humans are stubborn. It's not a superpower. It's just who we are. You push us and we push back. Not because we're the strongest thing out there. But because it's our home and we don't know how to be anything other than what we are. In the Galactic Council archives, the Sole Sovereignty Accord was filed under a category that had not been used in 340 years. Active precedent, resistance to integration, successful. Below it, in the standard archival notation, was a brief descriptor of the species in question. It had been updated, as all species descriptors were, following their most significant documented event. The descriptor, as it appeared in the Council's permanent record for the next several centuries, read: Humanity, Homeworld, Sol 3, Earth, Status, Sovereign, Council Member, Active, Notable, first species to successfully resist Veth integration through active defense. Operational approach: terrain-based asymmetric engagement, information warfare, coalition building. Threat classification by adversaries, being revised. Council classification: cooperative, capable, underestimated. That last word had been added by the archivist. No one objected to it. Somewhere in the outer system, past the heliopause, past the cold boundary where Sol's influence thinned into the general medium of interstellar space, the Veth fleet was still traveling. Still accelerating slowly back toward the deep space they'd come from. They had not transmitted again. Had not responded to the formal notification of the Accord's ratification. Had not, as far as any of humanity's sensors could detect, communicated with any other party about what had happened. But they were thinking about it. Chin was certain of that. He sat in his office on the Johannesburg on the last day before the ships returned to Earth orbit and looked at the outbound bearing on the tactical display for a long time. The cold line of space that the Veth had come down and were now climbing back up. He thought about what Harvan had said, in the final minutes of the negotiation session before the Accord was signed. It hadn't been in the formal record. It had been a comment made while the delegation was preparing to leave, not addressed to anyone in particular, translated by Ruiz in a quiet note passed to Chin. This system is not what we expected it to be. Chin had thought about those words many times since. He thought about them now looking at the outbound bearing. No, he thought. It isn't. And then he stood up, turned off the display, and went to write the final page of his after-action report. There was still a great deal of work to do.